We'll give 1 or 2 more minutes for people to jump on, and then we will get started. Thank you for coming. Nick, why don't we move to the next slide? As mentioned, welcome everyone. And for those of you who haven't yet and you'd like to, please introduce yourselves in chat. We'll be starting in 1 minute. Well, Catherine, we haven't been speaking either, so hopefully your sound will work out. We need to get some bumper music. Okay, I think it's time we can start. Welcome everyone to the simulation design workshop by SchoolSims. My name is Ken Spero. Nick, next slide, please. I'm the president and founder of SchoolSims, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session. And again, we're hoping that this is going to be an interactive session. We're going to be working together, my partner and I, who I will introduce in a second, on the process of simulation design. And so hopefully we can engage you all in the process and to demonstrate the potential value that not only Sims provide in their use, but also in their design. That's really our focus for today. I will be joined in this conversation by Dave Versteeg, former superintendent from Iowa. Dave, want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ken, and welcome everybody to the webinar today. I'm really looking forward to the interactive part of developing a sim that hopefully in a short amount of time we'll be able to share with everybody.
That will be the goal. Nick, next slide. So as many of you, for those of you who have heard me speak before, you know I've been doing this for quite some time. I'm nearing 35 years now of designing and using simulations. I am that carpenter with a hammer in my hand and everything looks like a sim. Nope, not there yet. If you could just back up for a sec, Nick. And one of the things that is so compelling about the idea of simulation, we all know that experience is the best teacher. I'm sure you're all tired of hearing me saying that, but we all know that, right? From infancy through how we grow up, that's how we learn. That's how we learn our most important lessons. And you wouldn't put a pilot in a plane, you wouldn't put a surgeon in an operating theater without hours in simulation. So the opportunity to think about preparing our administrators, preparing our teachers, both to enter into the job in education or even to get better at what they're doing, because the problems that we experience, we continue to experience them in new ways and obviously new problems, right? Everything's unprecedented until it happens. So in unpacking the idea of experience and the value that it provides, simulation is an experience for participants to play, right? It's a safe space to make mistakes and to learn from them. But the thing about experience is that it's also valuable to think about the problems that we experience through an experience design lens. And what I mean by that is the fundamental power of experience is the opportunity to fail, but safely. From a design standpoint, it's also helpful when we think about how we fail and to be able to articulate that. Because the fact is when we design instruction, we teach the right way of things, but that's not how we learn from experience. We do need to know the right way of things, but at the same time, we need to have the opportunities to get it wrong, to flex within issues where we can exercise judgment. Next slide, Nick. And really to focus on this, from the design standpoint, the two of the key skills that we look at, in addition to whether it's leadership, whether it's teaching, whether it's counseling, the two of the key skills we focus on, whatever role it is on the one hand, we have to be able to exercise good judgment. We need to make the best decision we can, even knowing that it may not be what everybody agrees to, right? We have a group of stakeholders who don't agree with each other, and they're not always rational. So we still have to make the best decision we can, but given that circumstance, we need to be resilient. We need to be able to roll with those hopefully figurative punches. And the thing about judgment and resilience, what we want to focus on, you can't really teach them. So how do we design an experience in which these can be manifesting? Not that I can measure whether you got it right, but whether I allow you to exercise judgment and to experience the consequences that happen. The next slide, Nick. And what is ironic, what I continue to be amused by, if you will, although not really, haha, is when you think about, this is one version of 21st century skills, lifelong learning. There's a variety of frameworks and models that have been put out. This one was done by the World Economic Forum a few years ago. What's compelling, what I found so compelling about this is the idea that if you look at this way of looking at these 16 lifelong skills, and this is what come from employers and from post-college, that these are the skills that are most important for people who come out into the workspace, whether it's college or other, right? When you look at the orange and the blue columns, you can't really teach any of those things. We only get better at them through experience. And so the opportunity to find a modality in which we can actually bring these issues out so people can experience them is incredibly powerful. And that's why this is the, again, in my carpenter status, that everything looks like a sim, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Because you can see that the original graphic that I showed, the colorful one, where it talks about the value that you get out of playing Sims. But if you go in the other direction, it's the value of the writing Sims. It's the gift that keeps on giving, because it can be so valuable when we think through an experience lens to give in so many different ways. So with that in mind, that is kind of the quick overview of really to get us in this mind space of unpacking a problem of practice. And we can sit and talk about problems. We can talk about learning loss. We can talk about equity. We can talk about them in grand ways, in macro ways, and we can talk all about the problems and how they manifest and the terrible tragedy of many of these issues and how they're playing out in our schools. The problem is we don't spend enough time. My sense is we don't spend enough time focusing on, but what do I do about it? And me as a teacher in a classroom, or me as a principal in a building, how do I make it? How might I make a change to that? And inside of my little sphere, how do we focus our attention into that micro level where the focus is on my behavior, whoever the me is, and my skill development? That's what we really want to get to in this exercise. Dave, thoughts?
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I'm going to sum up what you eloquently said in that I think the best Sims put the character in the hot seat from the get-go. That there's a little bit of background information, context, but that opening scene is so critical to really just make you sweat. Like, what am I going to do? How did this happen? And now how do my choices, my decisions impact what I might or might not do? So that again sounds, like a simple task, but I think we're going to show you today there's a lot of layers to it and there's a lot of intricacy to it, and it's a process. And I think SchoolSims as an excellent process for working through that, and we're going to show you those initial steps today. And you've already participated in that by helping us define a problem of practice today, and we're going to jump into that pretty soon.
And Nick, next slide.
And there you go. So through a vote, and it was really close, and I think we've got some good ideas for additional Sims. We're going to focus our problem of practice today on implementing a school-wide program or decision around learning loss. And specifically, if you want a little context of that, I think this word just comes from COVID schooling and kids being out of school, hybrid school, online school, and eventually when they're back to being assessed and sort of being gauged on what did they learn, we've found out that like these poor second graders, 3 years of literally no school, a lot of learning loss. And so our goal today is to think about, that's the broader issue we're trying to focus on, but what's the character, what's the situation in which we're going to put that person in the hot seat to realize, like, so what am I going to do about learning loss? And how are these decisions difficult? And can I see the outcomes ahead of time to decide not the easy route, not the right route, but like, what route am I going to take? And what are the consequences of that? That's the experience of this without actually having to do it. So learning loss is our topic, and I'm sure a lot of you have some great experiences with that, and we think it's timely for those people that want to have some practice in how to deal with this. So we're going to focus on that today.
And as we as Dave and I have talked about this, in terms of getting started, one of the key things, as Dave mentioned, is we do have to pick a protagonist, right? Whose life are we looking at? And we're going to look at this through the lens of a teacher. Obviously, the challenge of learning loss can be looked at multiple levels, but for our purposes, we'll look at the through the lens of the teacher, and we're going to expand from there in terms of, well, what does that mean, and what are the key challenges that we experience? What is the experience we want people to have so that they can build those skills or modify their behaviors to address this issue, which manifests now, right? We're not talking about, well, what if? No. We're actually starting with, you're walking into a deficit situation. This has already taken place. Now we have to deal with. That's the context from which we will be starting. Next slide, Nick. And just for those of you who aren't familiar, and you can find more information about this at our website, we have obviously developed a whole library or libraries of simulations, including leadership-oriented ones, teacher-oriented ones, and counselor-oriented ones. And we're not, those, you can see more about each of those at our website, SchoolSims.com. I invite you to do that. But just to give you a sense of, there's no shortage of problems of practice that we can benefit from having some experience doing. Next slide, Nick, please. Okay, click down again. So we've identified the macro problem. But in a moment, we're going to actually drill down into, okay, let's talk about the specific problem. If I'm a teacher and I'm walking into my room and I'm worried about what am I going to do? What is that manifestation inside of that issue of learning loss? So we want to be able to get down to the level of the actual problem that we're going to experience. And go down again, Nick. The next aspect is, many of the issues that we're going to struggle with, and especially those that require judgment, are contextual by nature. These are issues that they're not binary. It's not a yes or a no. It's not a do I or don't I, right? It's all kinds of shades of gray. I'm dealing with a situation where I've got one student, but I've got other students. I've got one parent, I've got other parents. I've got one colleague, I've got other colleagues. I've got a principal, but that principal can manifest in a variety of different ways, or district, or community, or whatever the case may be. What are those elements that are at play? What are the demographics of the situation that I'm dealing with? What kind of district am I in? Am I in a rural district, or urban district? Am I in a big city, a small city, suburban? All these elements have an influence in terms of situational awareness to the context in which we are going to be making decisions. Right? We're not focused on creating the experience that is the same for everybody, because it's clearly there's no such thing. So how do we create something that is authentic, that is realistic, that's recognizable, but is based on a particular context, so that as we think about it, we can also think about what's different about our situation. The beauty of the modality is that once we're engaged, we can benefit from things that are in front of us where we're struggling. The dissonance is right there and we have to make choices. The dissonance could also be, well, wait a minute, that wouldn't happen in my district. Well, why not? And being able to provoke that kind of discussion can be very powerful. Do you have thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah, that's really starting to layer this, why it gets complicated and yet seems simple at the same time. And and we're going to talk a little bit later about how time is such a factor in this, and how do you represent time in a simulation. That gets to be really tricky. And then just the context of other values that people share and want to articulate. It's fun. That's where, when you talk about it, it's fun both ways, because it's really fun to write sims and to think about how do you tell that story, but yet tell it in the way that puts people into this experiential learning situation.
That's great. All right, Nick, next slide. And so real quickly, hopefully what we're going to unpack today is those first two. And now if you click again to get to 3 and 4, we'll also have to define, what does success look like, or what is kind of that scorecard, if you will? What are those underlying trade-offs or variables that are at play that make the decisions difficult? Right, there's always pluses and minuses that we're evaluating between, or different stakeholders. So what are those? And then just really think about more broadly the overall experience you want people to have. What is it you want them to struggle with? What do you want them to walk away with? So that we can then shape what it is that will ultimately develop. So given that, what we had hoped to do, we're going to jump right into the design process in a moment. But first, we wanted to actually allow for some sharing from some folks who have actually participated in the process, to share with you in their own words what the nature of their experience and the value that they experienced from it. And the first we'd like to start with is Denise Chumney, who is a former superintendent. Actually, the next slide. Former superintendent and currently a doctoral student at the University of Virginia. And she is going through the process now, and I'll let her take it from there.
Ken, thank you so much for having me here today. And I want to thank my professor, Dr. Dexter, for introducing us to this process in our course. We are designing a professional learning sequence for school leaders on a range of topics. My specific group chose the topic of whether or not a school district should implement metal detectors in its schools as a solution to a school safety threat around a child bringing a gun to school. And I'm really identifying with one of the aspects that Dave talked about, which was that time is such a factor in this particular type of professional learning design. In that, I think working in a school and being a school leader or a district leader is very similar to being Lucille Ball in I Love Lucy, where the chocolates are coming down the conveyor belt. And she eventually starts eating them all because she can't figure out where to put them. And our decision making is called upon to be that fast as well. And so having experience with a simulated, learning experience helps people kind of lay a foundation for not only helps them identify their own theory and use. What am I operating on that I don't fully identify as being my full belief, but it's kind of my knee-jerk reaction when I am taking a responsibility or making a judgment call as a leader or as an educator. But it also helps people experience the dynamics and the consequences and unintended consequences of other people's theories and use, and really helps us clarify what are the kinds of theories of action that are operating behind the scenes, particularly for our simulation. Is it that we need to convene the school board to have a harsher disciplinary code and hire more resource officers and essentially, call for a budget adjustment to buy these metal detectors immediately? Is it that we need to step up social emotional learning, double the size of our counseling staff, implement community circles in schools? Or is it that we need to say, the principal's not doing a very good job there, and it seems like children really disrespect his or her leadership, and it's time for a leadership change at that school? And all of these ideas and, other ways of approaching and tackling difficult topics that require a lot of adaptive leadership are really ripe for this type of professional learning design process, because people learn so much as they're plugging ideas and thinking about the implications of that, going through it. but also for the recipients of the design when it's complete. And we're showcasing our design this Saturday at our class, and we'll get some opinions from folks. But it's always really surprising to hear people vocalize their thinking about the choices they've made. And I think that, you know, this really is a ideal companion for an instructor to be able to pause and teach into different topics, but also just ways of approaching how do we help adults learn and grapple through situations that you know, all of the information that they need to proceed is not readily available. And so for that, I'm really grateful, and thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to share my experience. I want to turn it over to Lynn, Dr. Wheeler.
Hello, I'm Lynn Wheeler. I'm a former assistant professor at the University of Indianapolis who's actually still working there as a field experience coordinator in an adjunct role. I worked in K-12 schools for about 30 years before I came to the University of Indianapolis. And I must say, I love helping write SchoolSims. Dr. John Summers, who hopefully will be able to join us later, and I were involved about 5 years ago in receiving a grant from the Lilly Endowment to create SchoolSims and case studies to facilitate collaboration between school principals and counselors. And we have worked, continuing to work with Chad Checketts, who is a writer for SchoolSims. And honestly, I feel like he's a colleague at this point because we've had so many online conversations and sharing of information, debriefing, arguing, whatever. In terms of how we use SchoolSims at the University of Indianapolis, they are part of our curriculum. And so students are using various SchoolSims in different courses, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups. And then we have assessed their progress on the Sims pertaining to various learning outcomes that we have for our future building level administrators. We also currently have a program where the School of Business and the School of Education are collaborating in preparing school principals. And we find our colleagues from the School of Business are on board, of course, with the utilization of SchoolSims for all kinds of skills that we work to develop in our preparation program. A couple of other quick things in terms of, I guess I would say, things I didn't expect to take away from this experience that have been important to me. One is identifying the topic is sometimes a little more challenging than what we originally had thought. Part of that is because there are Sims that have already been created pertaining to some topics that have endured over the past few years. An interesting sidebar on that is we collaborate with our school partners to help create artifacts, which of course we de-identify, and to provide feedback about the Sims. And that has enhanced, I think, the learning experience for everybody, not just our students, but our stakeholders. We, on a personal level, and then I'm going to sign off because there's so much more that needs to be done in this webinar. When I first started being involved in working to create Sims, I guess I thought I was going to be focused on the right answer, the right response. And most of these topics, foci, are so, what shall I say, they're open to all kinds of interpretations. And while we still have branches that students can move off into where, no, it's not going to be good, and they'll have to redirect to another course of action. But the discussion and learning that comes from hearing multiple perspectives about how to address challenges has been significant. Thank you for letting me be here, and I look forward to what's next.
Thank you, Lynn. John, I saw that you had joined. Did you want to add anything? Don't know if he's muted. Okay. Thank you both very much for sharing your experiences with it. And again, one of the things that we have found actually where we run into the most trouble with people who are new to this process is, as you said, Lynn, focusing on the failure paths. Right? We like to talk about the right things. We talk about our experiences that go badly, right? We do tend to share from that standpoint. But when it comes to thinking, prospectively about what could go wrong, we don't really like to talk about that so much from a design perspective, right? We like to think about the right way. We like to think about where things should go, or we'd like them to go, and to unpack things in terms of the kinds of experience we want people to have, which is those realistic decisions that go badly, right? Not bad choices per se, but maybe not as good of a choice at that time. And then to experience what that's like so that you can be that much more thoughtful when you actually face it for real. So with that in mind, and again, thank you both very much. And if anybody has questions, feel free to put them into chat, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity for some responses. But let's move into the actual activity. So Nick, are you able to go back a slide? So you don't have to, I know it's small, but just to give you a sense of where we're going. This is a one-page overview that we call them simulation overviews, which some of you have actually asked for them off of our website. We have a one-pager for every sim that we have, and really just provides that snapshot of kind of the experience that the sim represents. But we also found that if you can actually write one of these, right, you're pretty much describing a sim. What will ultimately get developed, because up front, these are the things that we're ultimately going to build around, if you will. We're creating the from a painting perspective, right? We're establishing the canvas, we're creating the frame, we're maybe even starting to outline some things that we're going to color in to create the work of art, if you will. So this is what we're going to develop, and our commitment to all of you on the call is we will share this one pager shortly after the webinar, and we're actually going to interactively work with you, anybody who's interested, in fleshing this out into an actual sim. And we'll have it into an alpha beta stage, over into January. But really the opportunity to have you experience firsthand the potential value of thinking things through from this perspective and see where things go from there. So with that in mind, Dave, did you have anything to add?
That's exactly right. This is kind of our outline for the next part where it's going to get very interactive. And I really appreciate what Lynn and Donaldo were saying about the intricacies of writing the sim, because it really doesn't matter what the topic is. The best sims always have some level of the main character having to wrestle with their own biases and their own value clarification about some of the difficult decisions they're going to have to make. But then the art and the science and the practice of communicating and decision making, which is the part we're trying to help people learn how to do, because as you showed in the 21st century skills, those don't come with right and wrong manuals. So there are some commonalities to the best sims, and we're going to try to base our gathering of information today on those, and then start to flesh that out in this one pager.
Okay, so Nick, if you can go forward 2 slides. So this is the process we're going to follow, and we are absolutely asking for audience participation in this, as we did with choosing the topic. But we'd like people in chat to begin to give us some guidance from which we will then develop this. Clearly the idea of learning loss in the classroom, dealing with it, is a big enough problem that every perspective that is shared amongst this group here is of course valuable, and it's unique and it's valid, right? Because each of us have our own perspective, and the only way we get to know what each other's perspectives are is if we communicate, right? If we share, if we talk. So we'll keep that. We're going to try and move this along as quickly as we can. But so we've defined that the idea is the protagonist is a teacher, but what subject and what grade? So any idea, anybody out there have a specific interest in a particular grade level? I mean, Dave mentioned the second graders. I was just working with another university last week on a sim, and they're co-located with a charter school, and the graduate school of ed is right next to the preschool, and there's a lot of crying going on. And they talked about the idea that the preschool is filled with COVID babies. And these are kids that were born in 2019 who weren't socialized for the first couple of years of their lives that, you know, kids normally have. So what's your thinking in the dealing with this learning loss? What's compelling? So math loss, upper elementary. Thank you, Aaron. Other thoughts, or people agree with that or want to see that?
I'll chime in. I work at a school site, elementary. COVID's impacted students significantly. If you're using the phrase learning loss, definitely. A lot of the students, second grade is actually an issue at our school site. You see that students didn't get a lot of the introductory foundational supports that they normally would have gotten in kinder, TK kinder, and first grade, and they're moving into second grade with very low foundation, even foundational skills. And so we've been identifying sort of key things that we need to do to tackle that. So I would agree with the second grade thing as an elementary site principal.
Okay, so we've got two options. We've got math loss at middle level. We've actually got a number of votes there. And then we have the social aspect at the lower level. Now, for those of you, you know, obviously we're going to pick a path. But by all means, you know, we're open to talking. As you can tell, this is what we do. And so the opportunity to continue development on whatever paths are always an option, and happy to have those conversations offline. But for our purposes here, it does seem like our vote, we've got a lot of math skills coming up.
Yeah, so my thinking about how we're going to decide, again, you know, we're part of what my view would be is, again, we choose something that can also be replicable to other people in other grades and other situations. So it's while math may be the content, what we really need to focus on is, because we don't want to write a sim for every subject matter. Whatever we choose, we need to choose it so people can see themselves in that role, even though it might be math, or even it might be a 4th through 6th grade teacher, that there's some crossover that the character will be able to help everybody understand what they're going to do. So we try not to pinpoint it so specifically or make it so specific that a non-math person would just find it like not understandable.
Agreed.
Okay. So
why don't we cut the difference, say 5th grade?
let's keep going, and then you and I, Ken, will circle back to this, and we'll either narrow it down to a couple of choices for everybody, or we'll just say this is the one we're going to go with. Okay.
Okay. I think it might be helpful.
Let's keep going and talk about. We've kind of talked about number 1 and number 2 at the same time because we're hearing elementary, middle school, or middle level. So that's good. Really interesting question Ken posed to me the other day is, what time of the school year is this? Because that is a really important piece of context for the work that's going to be done. So again, if I was basing this learning loss on like statewide testing, I would have probably gotten those results in the spring from a fall test. So is my school then going to work on this before the end of the school year for the next school year? Or are we going to come back like one of our pre-service days before the start of school in August and work on this one day before school is going to start? Or do we have a summer workshop going on? So, you know, time of the year is going to be pretty important to the context here.
And what's interesting is, and again, while you're thinking, and please submit your thoughts, if you talk about the idea of blending between the two, right, the math and the social, even if it's not necessarily at the 2nd grade level, maybe, you know, it is the beginning of the year where those social aspects of the summer, maybe whatever it was last year, we can start to blend in some of those. That's part of that context, right? That where the problem is going to manifest in the decisions that we need to make, where we're now beginning to find opportunities to address both in the context of, you know, because what's important to remember is what we're simulating is not the problem. It's time. We're simulating a period of time for a teacher inside of which this manifests. But the focus is on that flow of time. What are the things that are happening on that timeline? And obviously those, they don't happen one at a time. They don't happen in any order. And they don't happen where you walk into a bubble and nothing else is going on, right? There's always something else going on. And so the opportunity to be, you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, or as that I'm not going to be able to get the Lucille Ball image out of my head, Donalda. Thank you for that very much. You know, where she's just, you know, stuffing chocolates everywhere, because that's just the nature of the job. So what are your thoughts, everyone, in terms of what time of year we should target with this initial timeline?
Ken, we've gotten just a variety of good answers. Everything from spring to summer to mid-year. So people just need to weigh in. So let me ask you this question in a different, with a different context. Which time of the year would really put the teacher more in the hot seat?
Well, we seem to be getting a number towards the latter part of the year.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So,
I think we can. That's good. I think we can go with that. We'll. Yep.
So now the next thing we're going to want to, you know, to place this somewhere. You know, we've got the classroom, but what building? Is this an urban building, a suburban building, a rural building, a large district, a small district? Obviously, if it's going to be part of that'll be defined. But, you know, what kind of system are we operating in that where this is taking place? Any thoughts? Thank you, Sarah. I thought that was the case. Wasn't it only urban schools that have a problem? Okay, so we seem to have a suggestion to go with suburban. Okay, is it a large or small, medium sized? What size district? Or does it matter? Multiple elementary schools, 2 middle schools, okay. What are you gleaning?
Some really good ideas, Ken. Boy, people are really understanding how each one of these options is contextually, you know, really going to influence the sim.
Yeah, it's funny how it seems like
Just like Sarah's comment about having a central office versus a really small school where, you know, you just have a principal there. That's just completely different dynamic for what might happen here.
right, and the answer cannot be go grab some resources. That
Exactly.
the issue is on you. Okay. Okay. So are we in agreement? Are we, anybody disagree with that approach right now, that we can use that as a focus? And again, hopefully you're beginning to see that as we unpack this, as we peel back this onion, if you will, right? Each layer, and maybe onion is not the right metaphor, but you know, each layer is important, right? And it's, first of all, that there are all these layers, right? Each of these elements are part of those trade-offs that might exist, and whether or not we can deal with it directly, or a student from not this kind of system but something other is engaged because of the underlying, you know, we didn't talk about this in the beginning, but the underlying power of this is the story, is narrative, is the fact that we can't help but be engaged. I mean, educators are in this. This is a passion, this is a mission for most of us. And so combining that with the fact of stories and how we're engaged by stories means we get people hooked. And once they're hooked, then there's the opportunity to develop further, not to teach, but to allow them to provoke the opportunity for discussion, for difference. That dissonance becomes that power of discussion. And that's really what the sim's all about. Sims aren't about a product that you finish. Oh, I have to finish the sim. We don't have to finish the sim. because it's about having an experience. And if the experience that we're having provokes meaningful conversation, that's good too. So we identify something that is close enough, but allows for that dissonance so that everybody is going to find something different in it, because that then enables additional discussion that can be had. And then where it goes from there is obviously dependent on where it's being utilized. Okay, so now we're
Okay,
down
on to 5 and 6. So you kind of got to think about 5 and 6 together. We really want to be able to do a little more work in fleshing out what is the problem and what makes this a problem for this teacher more than for you or me. And at the same time, you have to sort of have the presenting scene where the problem first manifests. So we want to talk about what the problem is.
I'm gonna take some creative license here and just think, let's think about, because I think people already have a picture in their mind of the problem. So let's jump to 7 for just 1 second, because if we're thinking about this as a problem, are we thinking about this in the classroom? And we'll probably talk about this more on the next slide, but the idea that, is this something that is student facing? Are we dealing with a student that is having a problem in math? Is this a problem that we want to fix and we are having to work systemically we have to get some resources that we want, or we have to make a change? So who are the characters that we're interacting with as part of this problem? Is it a group of students? Is it are there other stakeholders? Are there colleagues, other teachers? Are there other potential resources that would be present in a building, counselor or special ed or whatever? Is there a principal or an AP that we want to have, or a department chair? Who are the possible characters that we'd want to have in this that would be kind of, if you think about a ripple effect in this problem, and they don't have to be exact, but who's in that ripple effect that we'd want to be cognizant of? Parents, obviously, sorry, didn't mean to leave them out, that might have a play in making this. And we talk about this idea of what makes it a problem. Well, this is kind of what makes it a problem, could be that it comes back to 5. So to Dave's point, any thoughts about who our cast of characters would be? First year teacher, that's good. One thing we didn't talk about is how many years in the classroom. So thank you for raising that. That is another aspect of this, right? So what expectation do we have of one's ability in terms of the decision choices, right? A seasoned teacher may be different than a first-time teacher, although this requires wholly different behaviors. It might be the same if you have to do things differently than they had in the past. But that's good, okay? That's great. So I think that's, thank you for that opportunity there. That we'll process this. This one is a little more difficult to just throw 1 or 2 up. So we'll capture the flow of your input. So thank you for that in terms of fleshing out what the cast of characters might look like. And then as we continue to design, we'll be able to have those interactions take place with those characters in mind, with those cast members in mind, and also be thinking about what students we're dealing with, right? Or how many of them do we want to have an interaction with? Okay, Dave, now go back to 5.
Yeah, and some people have, I'm going to interpret what some people have said. What makes this problem is many of you are saying that the teachers come across some data that says we've got a problem here. Whether it's the idea of I've been using state assessment or district-wide assessment, and I've uncovered this learning loss and where kids are and where they should be, or in our PLC meeting, we've come across some data. Seems to be a data-centered problem. Is that what a lot of people are saying? And then what would make it more of a problem for this teacher than you or me would probably be the data is really specific to their class or to their responsibility to do something about, as opposed to somebody who says, well, those aren't my kids, or somebody who has an attitude that it's just not my problem. It's your problem. Yeah, Aaron brings up a good point. We're going to have to flesh out the data. And again, is this, you know, an overall general classroom situation, or do I have subgroups that are further and further behind? I mean, that's exactly how we have to put this in the right context for people to think through, what am I going to do? What does this data say? And in the sim, we could actually, you know, add that data to the sim for people to actually look at. I mean, it can be, in a sense, our real data, where we don't need to just talk about it. We can put something in there as an attachment that people can sort through and make some decisions on.
So this is, I mean, what's fascinating about that, you know, taking that approach, right, is that lends itself now to a couple of different paths. You know, what I'm seeing, right? You've gone down the data path, which could be, you know, how we deal with learning loss is actually recognizing there is data, and then what data to use and how to read it and how to interpret it and what to do with it once you've interpreted it. Another way of looking at that same, you know, from the same point of view, from the same place, rather, looking at a different point of view, would be, okay, we've got this data. Now, how do I actually implement it, right? When I'm dealing with, and now we're dealing maybe with those social issues, when I've got one student, so I have my starting point is I have this data. Now, what am I going to do to improve this student's performance? And what does that mean relative to other students? How do I focus? How do I then implement when I've got maybe, and bringing in what was raised about the social issues, right? I have a student who's challenged and is not particularly motivated. What do I do then, right, in dealing with, right? Because they're not just because we've identified that there's learning loss, I'm guessing, doesn't mean that we can automatically turn on a spigot and they catch up. So now we decide, where does that timeline begin, right? Are we starting with that presenting scene that Dave mentioned? Is that really that important part? Is that presenting opening scene where the problem presents? And then what do we do, right? Then we're off and running in terms of which path we follow in our adventure as we progress through it. But it's, you know, to me, it's always fascinating to see, as you begin again to peel these things back and look at the actual problems inside of the problem, it kind of becomes something other than we thought it was, right? Lynn, I think, was referring to that. We start in one place and end up on something else. And they're both important, right? And it's just being able to translate that down to that level of specificity, because now we're getting down where we actually do exercise judgment and we really do experience consequences where there are stakes. There are pretty significant stakes when they're happening in real life. So what are your thoughts, Dave? Do you still want to go down the data path? Do you want to go down the behavior path? Do you want to do both?
I think we are more aligned for the implementation of what are we going to do. The data becomes clear. We can start with that point, but I think the real experience for people is, so now what?
Okay, works for me.
Because as a lot of us know, in whether it's a building level implementation or a grade level implementation, you know, it's what happens in the classroom that we really need to focus on. That's going to make a difference. So I think that we need to put the context to the data says this, but the real crux of the sim becomes, what's this teacher going to do about their role or everybody else's role? Or there's probably going to be some conflict that implementation isn't going well, and this teacher needs to make some decisions about that.
That sounds good. What are everybody's thoughts? We aligned with that?
Yeah, Donalda asked a really good question that we've got to come back to and a little bit more, and that is, what are we trying to teach the person engaging in the simulation? What are we aligning our scorecard to? So Ken, you want to talk a little bit more about the scorecard and the variables?
Yes, that's really good. Thank you for that. Thank you for that reminder, Donalda, and thank you for catching that, Dave. So, you know, So we use internally the word scorecard, and that goes back to my past. And it's a bit of a misnomer. So it's not about assessment. It's not about, telling you whether you did well or whether you did badly. It's really an opportunity to give you a snapshot of what happened with the decisions that you made, right? And again, it comes back to those underlying trade-offs, those underlying variables that are at play that make decisions difficult, right? When we're dealing with something like learning, when we're dealing with a student who's got learning loss, right? There are going to be a number of issues. There's social emotional issues at play. There's teaching standards at play. There's issues relating to policies in the building. There's expectations of parents. There's expectations of whomever, right? All of these things are playing off each other. There's a lot of appropriate answers, a lot of valid answers, and each of them come with a cost, right? There's a negative, there's a downside, because if that doesn't exist, then obviously this isn't something that needs to be simulated. It's binary. Do it or don't do it. If there's judgment involved, then what are the things that require judgment? What are we deciding between? And so if we can capture a set of variables that represent the manifestation of this problem, or the behaviors underlying this problem, or stakeholders, right? Because often, the trade-offs are stakeholders, right? I can do good by one student and it has a negative impact on another student or a group of students. I can do something for a student and it has a negative impact on the parents or on the administration, whatever, so that's a possibility in addition to the standards. But it's really important that we think about, because again, as we think about our painting, right, this is going to help provide a more visible frame to the experience we're going to have, because those are the trade-offs that we're evaluating between in order to be successful at, or as successful as we can be at navigating this challenge. So when you think about this, as we've begun to define it, what jumps out at you as some of the key trade-offs that are at play that we'd want? And these can come from the standards, from either CAPE or in task. They can come from, again, the stakeholder issues, some social emotional issues. What are some of the variables that you think, the trade-offs that are at play that make this a problem? And as Dave mentioned earlier, that make it a different kind of problem for you versus me, or again, from building to building, from person to person, or even from classroom to classroom in the same building, or from day to day. What are the things that we're having to evaluate between in making decisions that you think are compelling relative to navigating this experience? Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Any thoughts on that?
It is the hard part. Sometimes the other things come easier, but yeah, I think a lot of I like to go back to the standards and try to anchor it to some of those standards that aren't just black and white, and to give people practice in those, and to give some feedback on those in these things, because that's kind of an area that doesn't get a lot of attention.
And I would say, my take on that, what I'd want to add to that is the social emotional component, right? So we can talk about social emotional issues, but here it's in practice, right? So this kid or a kid who has experienced learning loss, how are they feeling, and how are we feeding or helping or hurting how they're feeling? And then, the broader perspective, the focus on social emotional, as well as my own, right? So, I mean, we can incorporate some of our stresses as well. We don't often, I haven't seen as much focus on the social emotional well-being of the teacher themselves in their context, and dealing with the social emotional issues of those around them. So again, we can have, that blend of both the standards, because there's stuff that needs to happen, and then there's the manner in which it happens, and the importance, and sometimes that those will play off each other, but to incorporate both. Does that work?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's kind of be the focus of the presenting scene. Yeah, I got the notes, and we'll recap here in a second for everybody. So thank you.
Okay, so we can go to the next slide.
I think we can move on.
Yeah.
We just wanted to give people some other things to think about, considerations when you're developing Sims. And so Ken's just going to touch on these just really briefly, but when we frame a Sim, there can be a framework for a systems thinking versus an implementation versus a social interaction Sim. So right now we're kind of using the implementation model.
And really the distinction there is what scale you're looking at, right, of a situation. If I'm dealing with a challenge with a student or multiple students, but it's my interaction with them, right, then it's a conversation. And those conversations can be quite difficult, right? How you respond will trigger a response in kind or whatever, which leads down that domino effect. And it can be a very hard conversation to have or not. So capturing the flow of that timeline, if you will, is a very narrow timeline. And we're dealing with that situation. Like we just came out with the parent-teacher conference, right? That is a very focused Sim inside of which the timeline is pretty tight. On the other hand, we may want more of a system orientation where I'm dealing with some things in the classroom, which leads to something that happens maybe outside of the classroom, maybe something that happens in the community or in the district level, and something more broad is happening from the system perspective, and the consequences that we're looking at may take place over a longer timeline. Okay, so we can think bigger picture, if you will, if that would be kind of the strategic implementation side of things. Again, those are different scales that one can look at, or you can kind of, that implementation really is that Dave was mentioning, is kind of a little bit of both, right? Because we're going to have the interaction with the student and have the opportunity, and coming back to that role of time, right, is the flow of time that's happening. We're making decisions and there may not be an immediate consequence. The consequence may not happen till tomorrow. We want to make sure that there's the opportunity to have that experience as well, and to be able to connect those dots. Because in real life, sometimes we can't always connect the dots when the consequence isn't immediate, that we're not cognizant of, I made this decision and something as a result of this translated into a problem in the next classroom where the student went, and that's going to come back to me. And now, the problem gets bigger, right? But I need to be able to relate to the fact that it was triggered by my choice at the one time, and maybe makes it into a different kind of problem. So we want to be thinking about in that flow, in that timeline, to be able to capture those kinds of implications so that we can have the consequence and ultimately be able to have the opportunity to give feedback on that, so that we can tie a nice little bow around this to say, when dealing with this, these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about so that we can make better decisions when we face them for real. The other aspect of time is it's important, in a case study, we talk about the case and we talk about what we do about it, right? What's missing from that is the sequencing of time, the sequencing of decisions, right? You cannot do everything at once, right? We can only do one thing at a time. And so it's important to have the opportunity to lay out those things that happen in a sequence. The student does something, I have the opportunity to say something. Based on what I say, that means something else is going to happen. Now I can do another action. What the student does can trigger two things. One, I'm going to have to say something, and I'm going to have to do something, but we need to separate those two because they don't happen at the same time. So in parsing out a timeline, it gives us that flexibility because there's two opportunities for judgment being exercised. It's not just one, it doesn't just happen one time, and something else can happen that gets in the way of our implementation, right? Something's always coming up and gets in the way of we meant to do that, but before we got there, another student, whatever, screamed in pain, and I had to stop what I was doing and all of a sudden deal with that. So we want to be able to make sure that we have that opportunity embedded in the process where we can sequence things in the manner in which they would realistically play out, so that becomes, again, real, authentic from the standpoint of the participant playing it. And I have my cascade over.
That's excellent, Ken. And the last point is, we're not going to get there today, but yeah, getting to the point of decision making is you've hit upon it, is a really key part of the role of time. And what are those decision points, and how does that flow within the sim? How many of them are there? And then what we're going to really need some feedback from our participants on here in a few weeks is, as we flesh out a decision point, what is the participant's choice? We like to have like 4, 5 choices, and then the consequences of those choices are going to be good points for feedback from our participants.
So we're about at the top of the hour, and I'm realizing that some of you may need to go. So first of all, we thank you all for your participation. We're going to stay on, so everybody, if people can stay, we will continue to go a little bit further on this. But really, our commitment is that we're going to process. Dave and I will process this information, and we will share with you a prospective one-pager of what we've talked about today. One way of looking at it, right? And ask you for your feedback. And we'll send it to this in email. And that'll be followed up by, within a few weeks, kind of fleshing out kind of what that first decision point is with those choice options that Dave mentioned, which would lead us down, okay, then what happens after that, and what happens after that? And we'll flesh that out. So within, say, about 6 weeks or so, 6 to 8 weeks, and we'll give you more of a schedule after we've huddled. We'll actually have a playable sim after we've interacted through several iterations of this process, where we will share with you decision points, decision choices, potential consequences, and have you actively participating in the design of a sim, which we will ultimately produce. So, any thoughts, questions?
Ken, I just want to say thank you for having the opportunity to be able to participate in this, to hear.
Oh. Lost you, Aaron. Okay, well, we've lost Aaron. Hopefully she'll come back. Other thoughts? Nick, if you can actually go forward, and hopefully Aaron, are you back?
I'm here. I don't know. It looks like my internet. Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
I'm sorry. But I just wanted to say thank you. The I Love Lucy piece, the partnering, the work that we're doing with SchoolSims with our principal preparation program at UConn, it has received such outstanding replies, responses, reflection. And I just think it's nothing better than to put something like this in front of them. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Aaron. And actually, Nick, the next slide. We'd like to also, for those of you who are still, next slide, for those of you who are still here, we are going, our next webinar will be also with Dave, I think, dealing with a parent-teacher conference, which was something we developed recently at the teacher level. And, you know, it's a parent-teacher conference, a simulated event, if you will, and look forward to seeing you then. Again, we're happy to stay on for anybody who still has wants to talk further. But in the meantime, wishing you all wonderful, happy New Year, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and looking forward to the opportunity to engage with all of you. So thanks to our guests, to Lynn, to John, to Donalda, and look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, I'll apologize. I was involved in ed leadership curriculum
Ever challenging.
changes and so forth. So yeah, I was pulled out a couple of times. So I really apologize for that.
You were well represented.
Looks like most people left, Ken. Really, thank you. Great job. And I'll flesh out that one pager with my notes and then give you a chance to edit it, and we'll get started on getting that out to people here in a couple of weeks.
1 second, Dave. Nick, you can end the recording. Or I can end it.